triggered the world's largest pest eradication program. A remote island was facing an environmental catastrophe.
Do you want to know how humans destroyed an entire island? An island that was dying, not because of war or an earthquake, but because of a single simple decision made more than 2 centuries ago. Rats, cats, rabbits, and penguins that didn't even know how to be afraid. All of this happened on a single island that's no more than 34 square kilometers. The result was a massacre that lasted 2 whole centuries and a rescue operation that cost more than $24 million. Using planes, poisons, viruses, and even teams of specially trained dogs for the mission. This is the story of Macquarie Island, one of the strangest and harshest wars humans have ever fought against their own mistakes. Before we get to the shocking ending, there's one thing you need to know clearly. Every solution humans tried to apply here only made the disaster worse than before. Let's start from the beginning. From the moment when this island was as close to paradise as you could get. A world untouched by anyone. At the start of the 19th century, explorers arrived at a completely isolated spot in the middle of the fiercest ocean on the planet. What they found there was unlike any other place on Earth. The beaches were crowded with massive elephant seals basking under the sun without a care in the world. King penguins filled the coast with their loud and cheerful calls. But what truly set this island apart wasn't on the beach, but just a little bit further beyond it. Tall tussock grasses swayed gently back and forth in the wind, forming dense meadows that grew even taller than a grown man. And other giant plants, like Macquarie cabbage, rose up like towering green giants, completely covering the rugged ground below. This was no ordinary island. It was a parallel world where life had flourished freely for thousands of years. Far from any interference, the animals here evolved in complete isolation with not a single predator to threaten them, and this absolute safety shaped their entire way of life. Take the storm petrels, for example. They spent their days out over the open sea, and they only ever returned back to land at night to seek safety in deep burrows underground. It was a highly effective and clever strategy that worked for generations, simply because there was absolutely nothing for them to worry about. But this very sense of safety, this isolation that protected the island for thousands of years, was about to become its fatal weakness. The hidden passengers. At the beginning of the 19th century, seal hunters started arriving on the island in search of fortune. But their ships didn't just carry the hunters, but also crates and supplies. And without anyone noticing, small creatures that didn't belong here at all slipped in. Rats and mice weren't just passing pests. They were rodents that excelled at survival, and opportunistic enough to turn any new place into a permanent home. And for them, Macquarie Island was like the promised paradise. No predators, endless shelter, and food in every direction. And among this food were the most fragile creatures of all. The petrels themselves, these birds that had lived for thousands of years without ever needing to defend themselves from any land predator. Their safe nest suddenly turned into an open buffet for armies of hungry mice. The rats didn't stop at eating the eggs. They discovered that the chicks were easy prey, and that these sleeping adult birds were not safe from danger either. And they didn't stop at birds only. They ate everything they found: flowers, seeds, fruits, tender plants, leaving behind traces of destruction that quickly spread across the entire island. And despite their small size, the mice were far more numerous. They targeted insects, larvae, butterflies, spiders, beetles, and the threads that held Macquarie Island's ecosystem together. One by one, they began to unravel. At first, the hunters only noticed the damage to their own supplies. The rats and mice were gnawing at everything, turning their lives into a daily hell. Something had to be done, and at that moment the solution seemed completely obvious. Who was better at hunting rats and mice than cats? No one knows for sure whether their arrival was intentional or accidental, but by the early 19th century, one thing had become perfectly clear. Cats had become part of the island's fragile equation. And with them, Macquarie's problems were about to multiply in ways no one could have imagined. Now the island was teeming with thousands of rats and countless numbers of mice, and the cats roamed freely, and penguin birds that had no concept of danger, all sharing a very small space. What would happen next would become one of the most shocking environmental disasters in the history of science. Remember one number with me now: 60,000. Keep it in mind, because in just a few minutes, you'll understand why this number is the most terrifying detail in this entire story. When solutions fail, the cats were brought in to solve one problem, the rats and mice. For a short while, it seemed like it was going to work. Cats are skilled predators, and rodents are their natural prey. But on this particular island, where the birds had never learned what it means to fear a predator, the cats found prey much easier than the rats. Instead of chasing rodents, they turned their attention to the defenseless seabirds. Birds that had lived for thousands of years without any protection. Suddenly, they had no defense at all. They didn't know how to fly away to escape. They didn't know how to fight back. And the cats weren't just hunting to survive. They hunted just for fun. And here's the number I asked you to remember. 60,000 seabirds were being killed every year, at a rate of more than 160 birds a day. Think about that number for a moment. 60,000 every year on an island that's only 34 square kilometers in size? Entire species that had lived on this island for thousands of years started disappearing one after another. The Macquarie rail, a small, flightless bird, became completely extinct. The colorful Macquarie parakeet vanished forever. In total, more than 10 species of seabirds were wiped out completely. Some of them went extinct before scientists even had a chance to study them. And while the cats were hunting the birds, the rats were breeding nonstop, invading mess, devouring plants, and outcompeting any predator that tried to contain them. The cats that were brought in to solve one problem ended up doubling it into two. Then, as usual, the next mistake came with good intentions. In 1878, someone came up with another idea that seemed brilliant at the time. Following an old tradition, rabbits were released onto the island. The reason was simple. If a sailing vessel ever wrecked near the remote island, the surviving sailors would be able to find rabbits to hunt and eat. But no one thought about what would happen when these rabbits found themselves on a fertile island with no natural predators and an endless food supply. They multiplied at a terrifying rate. By 1968, there were an estimated 100,000 wild rabbits freely hopping across the entire small island. And they weren't the cute, innocent rabbits you might imagine. They were real eating machines, devouring everything in sight. The giant grasses that once defined the island, the thick tussock grass, even the roots and native plants. They ate everything down to nothing. Entire hillsides began to collapse as the vegetation disappeared. The island, which was once a vibrant green paradise, it started turning into a barren, deserted land. But the worst was yet to come. The authorities finally realized the scale of the disaster caused by the cats. So, starting in 1985, they launched a targeted eradication campaign, one after another. The cats were driven out, and by June 2000, the final tally was 2,479 cats completely removed from the island. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the island was completely free of cats. At first, it seemed like a real victory. Bird species that hadn't been seen in decades started to return. Striking blue and gray gulls that had long lost disappeared from the principal main island began to reappear. It was like ethereal ghosts returning to their rightful original home. Everyone felt that the battle had finally been won in favor of the island. But nature had another, even harsher surprise in store. As soon as their main predator disappeared, the number of rabbits exploded in a way the island had never seen before. This time, the numbers weren't just in the thousands. They exceeded 300,000 rabbits. They devoured everything green, the native grasses, the giant grasses, until almost nothing was left. The hills started to collapse under their own weight. The roots that once held the soil together disappeared. And with no plant cover at all, entire cliffs began to fall into the sea. The birds that had just returned found themselves in a worse situation than before. It's true that the cats were gone, but there was no longer any safe place to nest. The rabbits had eaten all the plants that the albatrosses and penguins needed to hide from the heat, rain, and other predators. The shearwaters that tried to dig their burrows again found only loose, crumbling soil that was completely unsuitable for digging. What was supposed to be a new chapter of life on the wild island turned into yet another disaster. And here, the scientists realized a painful truth. This wasn't just a story about rats, or just about rabbits, or just about cats. It was a whole chain of reactions set off by a single, simple decision 2 centuries ago, followed by another failed solution. The damage had gone beyond all limits, and half measures were no longer enough at all. If this island was to be saved, then the next step had to be radical, complete, and irreversible. So what if, instead of fighting one species at a time, the government decided to fight all 3 at once? That's exactly what happened next. By 2007, the scientists were staring at a real nightmare. Macquarie Island, which was once a vibrant sanctuary for penguins, seabirds, and rare plants, was on the verge of total collapse. Some experts clearly warned that without immediate intervention, the island might never recover. It had become what ecologists call an ecologically hopeless case. A place so devastated by nature that it could no longer heal itself. The Australian and Tasmanian governments realized that only one solution might work. Not just getting rid of some of the invasive animals, nor focusing only on the most dangerous ones, but removing every single invasive animal from the island. Every rat, every mouse, every rabbit, without a single exception. This was the largest terrestrial animal eradication project ever carried out in history. Its cost exceeded $24 million. It took years of continuous effort and involved a multi-pronged attack, from poisons to viruses to specially trained dogs for this mission. The first phase targeted the rabbits, the biggest problem, and the most obvious one. In 1968, scientists tried a virus called myxoma, and it reduced the number of rabbits to about 20,000, but that was never enough. This time, they turned to a deadlier weapon, the rabbit caliciva virus, also known as rabbit hemorrhagic disease. In February 2011, a bait from the island loaded with the virus was spread in the areas with the highest rabbit density. The effect was immediate and devastating. The virus swept through the colonies with ruthless efficiency, and within just a few months, the entire rabbit population collapsed. After that came the aerial assault. Helicopters loaded with 300 tons of poisoned food. They flew back and forth over the entire island, dropping bright green pellets, capable of killing both rabbits and rodents. The operation was carried out with extreme precision, executed specifically in the winter season, when most seabirds are away from the island, to minimize the risk of accidentally poisoning native species. But dropping the poison alone wasn't enough. Thousands of animal carcasses had to be collected by hand to protect scavenging birds from secondary poisoning. Workers spent entire months gathering the remains of rabbits and rodents from every corner of the island. Even so, the greatest threat still lay with the survivors. Even a single rat, or just one rabbit hiding in a deep cave or rocky cliff, could repopulate the entire island within a few years. And that's when the most dangerous phase of the whole plan began. The dogs. The dogs that arrived on Macquarie Island in 2011 were about to undertake the most important mission in the history of conservation. They were searching for the last surviving rats, mice, and rabbits. Each dog was carefully selected and trained for many months before adapting to the island's climate. They had to be strong enough to withstand Macquarie's harsh weather. Freezing winds, icy rain, and mud that could swallow boots whole. At the head of this canine army, there was a Labrador dog named Wags, working side by side with her trainer, Melissa Houghton. Her mission was to search every corner of the island without exception. The entire team ended up covering more than 90 kilometers, which is almost like walking around the Earth twice. This is where the dog's extraordinary sense really stood out. They were able to smell rat droppings that were weeks old, or track the scent of a mouse that had passed by just hours earlier, or follow a rabbit's trail all the way to its hidden burrow. Day after day, the teams would climb over rocks, make their way through the grass, and inspect every cave and every crack in the rocks, chasing down even the slightest trace. The pivotal moment came in late 2011, when Wags made a discovery that would go down in conservation history. Deep in a remote part of the island, the very last remaining rabbit family was discovered, an adult female and her young. The discovery was both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. It was thrilling because it proved that the dogs were capable of finding even the most hidden animals. And terrifying because if one family could survive undiscovered for all that time, there might be other potential ones out there. By 2013, the dogs hadn't detected even a single trace of rats, mice, or rabbits for many consecutive months on end, but no one was ready to declare victory just yet. The island had taught everyone such painful lessons that there was no room for absolute trust. They brought in 3 more dogs, and the search continued. The stakes were too high to allow for any mistakes. Everything, the poisons, the viruses, the hunts, the losses, had all led up to this very last moment. The island that had been devastated for 2 whole centuries was finally about to get a second chance. April 8th, 2014. A date that would become one of the most important in the history of global environmental conservation. After a full 7 years of the largest land-based eradication project the world had ever seen, Macquarie Island was officially declared completely pest-free. For the first time in over 200 years, not a single rat, mouse, or rabbit remained on the entire island. This announcement didn't come out of nowhere. It came after a mandatory waiting period of 2 full years without a single sighting of any invasive species. Then something extraordinary happened. The first signs of recovery didn't come from the scientists. Plants that had barely survived inside small fenced-off areas suddenly began to grow naturally in the wild. Seeds buried in the ground, some of them had remained dormant for decades, suddenly woke up from their slumber. Melissa Houghton, the dog trainer who discovered the last family of rabbits, decided to stay on the island as a scientist to witness this transformation herself. What was once described as a miserable, lifeless swamp began to transform once again into something wild, stunning, and almost magical. The tussock grasses started growing again, reaching heights taller than a person. Some areas became completely different from the barren land they once were. But it wasn't just the plants that came back. The birds responded even faster than the plants. Species that had barely been hanging on in tiny numbers suddenly started nesting again. The white-headed petrels, which were nearly extinct, saw their numbers grow rapidly. As for the blue and gray petrels, which had completely disappeared from the main island, they returned and began to establish entirely new colonies. This wasn't just a recovery, it was a true rebirth in every sense of the word. Experts had predicted that the island's recovery would take between 30 and 50 years, but major changes appeared in just a few short years. Some bird populations began to grow at a rate of 10% annually, which is an almost impossible figure in the world of conservation. 10 years after the island was declared pest-free, scientists returned to measure the results, and what they found exceeded all expectations. And beneath this dense green cover, penguin burrows appeared, winding, intertwined tunnels carved into the vegetation, as if they were secret roads built by the island's most dedicated survivors. Even the rarest plants on Earth have made a strong comeback. The 2 orchid species, which had been reduced to just a few plants confined within fenced areas, are now spread throughout the entire island. Today, scientists estimate that the number of native animals on Macquarie Island is greater than it was a full 150 years ago. The success of Macquarie Island has already inspired similar projects around the world. Countries like New Zealand are now using this very strategy to plan ambitious eradication projects on larger and more densely populated islands. But the island's safety remains fragile to this day. Every ship is inspected before docking. Trained dogs check the cargo, and even jacket pockets and backpacks are thoroughly inspected and cleaned to prevent any possible return of an old nightmare. The lesson is perfectly clear. The cost of prevention is nothing compared to the cost of a new disaster. So what have we really learned from the story of an island where thousands of rats were left alone with fearless penguins? Humans are capable of causing massive destruction, but they're also capable of fixing what they've ruined, no matter how impossible it seems. What part of Macquarie Island's story shocked you the most? Have you ever seen invasive species destroying an environment in your area? Write to us in the comments and share this story to remind others of what's possible when people decide to fight for their planet.